You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focus podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof. The smoking gun could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes already? Bulldoze their villages, seize their property and their laws. They had no part in making.
Now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Kyle Ansel.
This is episode 299 of the Foreign Policy Focus podcast. And as I approach episode 300, it's very fitting to have the person who's appeared in these 299 episodes the most, other than myself, of course, Will Porter on the show. This had originally kind of planned to be the second half of our year-end review show where we discuss the worst part of Trump's foreign policy in 2018. However, the kind of foreign policy events this week I think are so significant that I didn't want to take so much time to discuss them, as next week I will have on some really awesome interviews, including episode 300 of the show, and I'll go ahead and let everybody know that that will be Peter Van Buren discussing his books Hooper's War and We Meant Well. And I'm really excited to play that interview for you guys. It came out really well, and make sure you hit the subscribe button on one of the podcatchers or something so you don't miss that episode. I guess to officially introduce my guest here, Will Porter, everybody knows him, but if you don't because you're just tuning into the show for the first time ever, he is a journalist. He writes on Mideast affairs and U.S. foreign policy. His work has been published at antiwar.com, The Daily Sheeple, where he has a huge author archive that you could go back through and really catch, I think, a good breakdown of some of the most important foreign policy events in 2018. And then, of course, at the Libertarian Institute, where you could also find this podcast and my daily news roundup. So, Will, welcome back to the show. I think I talked enough now.
Hey, thanks for having me back on, man. Congrats on 300 episodes. It's amazing.
Well, thanks, so much. And I think here about 40 of them have been with you. And it's worth telling the audience that there is a YouTube playlist of all of our episodes done together. So if anybody, is like, oh man, I really love the Will Porter episodes, I will link to that playlist in the show notes page. That way you guys have easy access to. You could go back through and listen to all the different conversations that me and Will have had about foreign policy here. Will, maybe the topic that we've talked about the most, there's probably two, Russiagate and then the Syrian civil war. Although I do think the Syrian civil war is probably the most. Could be, I guess, the U.S. role in it at least is wrapping up here. So that's pretty crazy and significant if you look at the first 300 episodes of this show. But there's a big event here that is gaining a lot of attention, and you hear it everywhere from all the, the Borg, the foreign policy establishment, the neocons, the anti-Trump left, the never-Trumpers on the right, which is, this attack proves that ISIS is still up and alive and that the U.S. needs to stay in Syria. And so what you had here is the Islamic State claiming responsibility for an attack on, a suicide bombing south of the town of Manbij there. So right on the western side of the Euphrates River in northern Syria. The attack killed 4 Americans, 2 military personnel, 1 contractor, 1 diplomat civilian. And so, this is a big event. I mean, 4 U.S. military personnel dying in one attack. Certainly isn't even a monthly occurrence right now in the war on terror. I mean, it probably happens 3 or 4 times a year. So, big event here, Will, and lots to talk about. Do you have any other details of the attack that you think we should cover?
I guess we could say that. I'm not sure if you included the total number of dead. I think it killed 16 people, including those 4 Americans. And then I think there were 3 other American troops that were wounded. And as you said, yes, ISIS came out and took responsibility through their normal channels of doing so. And I think they even named a suicide bomber. And so, we don't have any real reason to doubt that it was ISIS. But yeah, it targeted, I think, a marketplace. It was near some restaurant in a town near Manbij. And yeah, I think those are the basic facts.
So I guess, the kind of libertarian skepticism, I guess, because I've, a lot of my libertarian friends have came to me today and said, hey, Kyle, any possibility that this is a false flag? So, well, I'm going to go ahead and pose that question to you.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly within the realm of physical possibility. I can't absolutely preclude this. However, I think it is pretty likely that it was just, as it was presented, that this was an attack by militants, a suicide bombing. Now, if it were to be some kind of false flag, if there's going to be more to this story than meets the eye, I think what's most likely would be that perhaps there was some kind of Turkish involvement, that this was the Turks had one of their Islamist militants do this and then pretended it to be ISIS, but that's completely speculative. I have no real reason to think that happened. And as far as I've seen, it does look like it was actually an Islamic State attack, and that, it's basically as it was reported.
Yeah, I agree. I heard somebody tell me, they pushed back a little bit and said, well, wouldn't this be counterproductive for ISIS? Don't they want the United States to leave? And I don't think that's necessarily the case. If you look at how the U.S. has handled the fight against the Islamist State, especially in 2018, it's been relatively moderate. At least as we've backed the Kurdish forces there, they haven't been that aggressive against the Islamic State. That they've continued to exist in small pockets around the Kurdish controlled area of Syria. And so, it doesn't seem to me inherently that ISIS would prefer U.S. control over Syrian government control or Russian control or anything like that. And in fact, their, bombing campaign and, attempt to wipe out ISIS could be even more brutal, including towards the civilians than the United States. So I just don't think, that you could take it from that angle either. I think the big question here, though, and definitely the most important one is, does this actually change the U.S. withdrawal? As I mentioned in kind of my description of this, is that the immediate reaction, in fact, the, first breaking news, notification I got on my phone was from the Washington Post saying that 4 Americans have died in an attack claimed by ISIS after Donald Trump claimed that ISIS has already been defeated. So, Will, I know you have a lot of analysis to go through here, so let's hear it.
Yeah, so the potential, what effect this could have on the U.S. withdrawal, I am a little worried it's going to be spun this way. Oh, look, Donald Trump, you lied when you said ISIS was defeated. We have to, continue occupying Syria for that reason. And I think that is sort of the way that a lot of the mainstream press has been, spinning this or pushing this news. But I think one particular worry I have is the reports of this large American force that's apparently stationed in the oceans around the region, in somewhere in the CENTCOM region. There's 4,500 Marines and a whole squadron of F-35s that are apparently going to be used, or they're there in case they're needed to support the withdrawal. And so what worries me is the potential for something like this to happen, a ISIS suicide bombing that's going to draw in this support force. And it could really represent a large escalation of the conflict. Right now, there's only 2,000 or so American troops that are alleged to be in Syria officially. And there's 4,500 Marines that could get involved, from the support force. So that would represent a huge escalation of events. So I think that's one major worry. When things like this happen, is this going to escalate the U.S. presence? Is it going to totally scuttle the withdrawal? And so I'm not sure. I'm hoping not. I don't think that will be the case, but that's one thing I'm certainly looking at.
Right. Well, I think there's a lot of factors here. The one thing I want to mention is I read this article about Rand Paul coming out of a meeting with Donald Trump and saying that, yes, we are leaving Syria and we are pulling some troops out of Afghanistan. And as far as I could tell, this meeting occurred after Donald Trump should have been informed of, this suicide bombing and death of U.S. troops in Syria. And so that certainly doesn't mean that his mind can't be changed, but hopefully it means he didn't have that immediate emotional reaction like so many of the Never Trumpers tried to exploit, saying we have to stay in Syria here.
Yeah, I definitely think Rand Paul has been a great influence on the president. It seems that they've been meeting and talking with each other more, and it seems like Rand's sort of positions are kind of rubbing off on him. It seems like Trump has been a lot better on the Syria question since he's been hanging out with Rand more.
I think one problem here is there's, of course, the myth that anywhere a U.S. soldier has died, that ground is sacred, and it means the U.S. must fight to, use that blood to fertilize the soil of democracy on that ground through as many bombs as it takes, apparently. And so now, if we leave Syria, it would be a great insult to the legacy of these men for giving up on the fight of ISIS too soon, and their deaths would then be in vain. So I don't know if you have any response to that, Will.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think as we've covered in the show so much, that the U.S. presence in Syria has not been totally, to defeat ISIS. There've been a lot of things we've done that sort of to help them gain ground and gain territory, especially when it hurt the Syrian government. And so I don't think it's quite fair to just say that, oh, we've only been there to fight ISIS and it would be such an insult to the legacy of these soldiers if we leave. No, I mean, continued presence is really an insult to these soldiers. Keeping them in harm's way, keeping them in this ridiculous, dangerous conflict that we really have no role in, that is an insult to them. That's the thing that's like having, too little regard for their well-being, I think, keeping them in harm's way like this. There's really not much an American presence could do right now with a couple thousand soldiers to defeat ISIS in its current insurgent form. I mean, yeah, we could fly sorties and back a bunch of Kurds to kick them out of large towns, but as we've seen in Afghanistan and many other theaters of conflict, American counterinsurgency is very poor. It's not a foregone conclusion that if we just keep our soldiers here, we'll be able to defeat ISIS, once and for all. Really, we're just keeping, red, white, and blue targets in the line of harm, in the line of fire. And so that's what I would respond to that kind of argument that says, oh, what an insult it is to leave. I think it's quite the contrary.
Right. Well, I think that we're in a situation in Syria now where there's an insurgency to the U.S. occupation of Syria. And in the U.S. occupied area of Syria, that's kind of ISIS. They're the terrorist insurgent group in that area. And so to a certain extent, the U.S. was able to go in and, quote unquote, defeat ISIS. They were able to kick ISIS out of Raqqa and out of Kobani and Manbij and all these other very important Syrian cities. But now I think that, just the occupying force being in Syria creates an insurgency to it. And so the idea that you would ever completely defeat that insurgency is impossible. And, we've seen this, even, Stanley McChrystal, more or less, one of these Coindonistas who really loves the counterinsurgency platform, admits that the problem is this insurgency math. You kill 2 insurgents, you end up with 20. So, there's no way to win this fight. And so, the U.S. has defeated ISIS as much as they possibly could in Syria, is what it seems like to me. And, now we're just fighting the insurgency to our occupation. That would go on forever. And so, that's kind of one of the problems. I think the other one is that now that we're fighting a counterinsurgency, the U.S. isn't kind of out on the front lines, maybe stationed back a little bit, but, kind of out there in these forward deployed positions, training Kurdish soldiers and giving them tactical advice on, the battlefields, some miles ahead. They're now stationed in cities and doing these kind of security patrols and all that stuff. And it made some prime targets for, insurgents and suicide bombers. And so I think it's possible, and this is very unfortunate, that if Trump, kind of drags his feet on the withdrawal, it's actually going to put the U.S. troops in more danger. I know this may seem a little counterintuitive, but, if they're way out there in these kind of fortified outpost positions, I think the U.S. troops may be a little bit safer than when they're in these like kind of softer targets in the cities.
Right. Yeah, exactly. They're in a sort of more vulnerable position when they're trying to pull out, when they're gearing up to leave. And yeah, to just to add to your point about the insurgency, there is a distinction to be made between pushing, the Islamic State when it's in its state mode, when it's occupying a city like Raqqa. There's a difference between pushing them out of a city like that and fighting them when they're back fully into their insurgent mode, where they just kind of melt back into the population. That's a sort of different type of fight you're having there. And yeah, the U.S. I think can be successful at pushing them out of cities like Mosul and Raqqa, but that, the later phase of the insurgency is a different thing.
Right. And it's always important to remember that when we say successful in pushing them out of Mosul and Raqqa, it means that they could do that. It's actually possible, not that it's necessarily a great thing. Where right. It's actually impossible to completely defeat the insurgency in Syria and Iraq with the U.S. occupation ongoing.
Yeah, I mean, just look at Afghanistan. I think that's staying in Syria now to fight ISIS in its current form is just a recipe for that kind of permanent mission creep kind of occupation.
Right. And I will say that the position of the U.S. troops kind of in the forward deployed training areas is, even safer in Syria than was Iraq, just because there you're training Kurds who are kind of your allied forces, where in Afghanistan, you're training Afghan and the Taliban are also Afghans. And so there's all these insider attacks and stuff going on in Afghanistan, which is so terrible and so dangerous. I did want to mention here, this is a point that Ron Paul made on his, show, the Ron Paul Liberty Report. Fantastic foreign policy analysis, as always, explaining that, this narrative that especially Republicans had to fight for every inch of ground a U.S. soldier has died on is ridiculous. Look at the Marine barracks bombing in Lebanon. Over 200 Marines dead, and we left. Reagan pulled them out. Mr. Republican, president takes off. And so I do think that's a good lesson. And, Reagan admits that the mistake was made by him and that the troops should have never been there in the first place. And Donald Trump should get the troops the hell out of Syria. This should be a sign to leave, not a sign to stay.
Yeah, that's a great model to sort of urge Trump to follow the Reagan model after the barracks bombing, to say that, wow, we shouldn't have been involved there in the first place. Like, that is the reaction to have. Not turn into Mr. Tough, big bad military man after you get attacked and then escalate everything. It's more prudent and wise and more, conservative and intelligent to do the smart thing and have restraint.
Well, you might not have much to say on the media and the politicians' reaction to this, but I'm sure, you probably have a few things here just because it has been so blatantly, just accusing Donald Trump of getting out of Syria too soon, saying that, look, this is proof the president is wrong. We have not defeated ISIS. And so, more take on that the media is the one saying this.
Yeah, I mean, it's like a nice little confluence of the never Trump people who have, no matter what happens, their whole interest is to make Trump look bad. And then, of course, the national security state and the hawks and the neocons and stuff. This is a very nice little confluence for them to come together. Because, of course, the never Trump people have every interest to say that, oh, Trump lied about defeating ISIS. Look, our soldiers are dying because of his ignorance, because he's leaving too early. And then, of course, the hawks have every reason to want to stay in Syria, and so they're going to basically hit on that same thing. And so, yeah, it's unfortunate how often this happens, where the faction who's supposed to be more humanitarian and more restrained, the left-leaning, the Democrats, they're completely, diffused. They're totally useless on this issue because of their antagonism toward the president. And that's pretty much characterized his whole presidency. All the left have been turned into total super hawks. Not all the left. We obviously know some notable exceptions. But, the mainstream establishment left has been turned into these super hawks. And, that fits right in with the hawks who've been hawks all along. They join forces. And that sort of it seemed to characterize the opposition to Trump. It's driven the left rightward, sort of.
Yeah, I definitely agree with everything you just said there. I want to move on to the comments by the French President Macron, saying that French forces will remain in Syria and Iraq for at least another year. The Iraq part, I guess, isn't surprising. I don't have anything to say about that. The Syria thing, I guess I just want to say in the past I had kind of blanketly dismissed that the French or the British would stay if the United States left. But I don't know. I guess I shouldn't be so quick to dismiss that. It's not impossible, I suppose, that the French, kind of plant their flag and say, we're staying, even though the Americans are leaving.
Yeah, we were laughing about this on the show, that the British were saying that they were going to stay, and we were like, what is it going to be, 5 guys standing around in Raqqa or what? But however, I guess they could maybe beef up their presence a little bit, or maybe they're aware of some things they can do with their very small presence to sort of, to have some kind of effect. But yeah, it would seem that the size, how small the presence is of the French or the British, it would seem negligible to, what effect is that going to have, keeping that small of a number of guys around? But yeah, maybe they have other ideas, and maybe they have ideas that they can beef up their presence. But yeah, I mean, I had always understood the French and British presence there to sort of be a token, total support, subordinate role. Not like they were really running their own missions. I thought they were kind of just tacked on to the American presence. But perhaps again, maybe they're going to figure out ways to stay involved and to increase involvement in Syria.
Yeah, well, I mean, from my understanding, they were deployed there as part of the coalition led by the United States. And I think the U.S. commander in Syria isn't just is the commander of all Inherent Resolve Forces. That's the name of the anti-ISIS mission there. So I believe they would be under direct authority, and I don't know how I don't know to what level this applies. If they laugh at their American commander if they feel like it and say, no, I'm not listening to you. But it seems like, at least in the international order of how things are set up in Syria, that they would technically be under the command of the U.S. forces there. So the last thing we have on Syria here is this proposal by Donald Trump, which, as it's stated, is a 20-mile long safe zone along the Turkish and Syrian border. So, that would include both Syrian Kurdistan and the Syrian, border west of the Euphrates River, partly controlled by the Assad government. And I don't know, it's an interesting proposal, I guess. I think we have a lot to talk about with it. So far, it has the backing of the Turkish government. However, the U.S.-backed Kurds have rejected it. So, Will, I'll go ahead and let you tell me what you think.
Yeah, I mean, I find it a little odd that, because Trump had proposed this 20-mile, security zone, I think they're calling it. And I believe it's 20 miles deep, and then it goes along, much of the northern border there with Turkey. I think even, beyond to the east of the Euphrates and stuff too, as far as I understand, from the map I saw. And so, yeah, it's interesting to me that the Turks would have agreed to this idea that, because their major concern, the Turks, is to get the Kurds out of this northern area to sort of diffuse their power or their influence in that area. And so it seems like the security zone, one of the purposes of it would be to protect the Kurds and to keep them, from falling to this Turkish onslaught. And so we would have thought that the Turks would have been against this, that no, we don't want a security zone for the Kurds. We don't want them to be secure. But perhaps Trump and Erdogan work something out that is going to allow the Turks to kind of expel or diffuse Kurdish power in that area. It's not completely clear to me, who would be patrolling the security zone, what troops would be. Would it be Turkish security forces? Would it be Turkish-backed, rebel forces? Would it be international forces? It's also not clear to me if the Syrian Arab Army would have some part in this, because we have seen the Syrian Arab Army, Assad's forces, move in to at least deploy around Manbij to sort of diffuse some of the tensions between the Kurds and the Turks. And so it's not clear to me if the Syrians would have some part in this. However, we do know that the Russians and the Syrians are saying that, this part of Syria really does need to be returned to, Syrian sovereign control. And so definitely Assad is going to want to have some part in this, but it's not clear to me if he's been offered one or what the status of that is.
Well, I mean, it seems pretty clear to me that if you look at the actors on the ground and who, what relationship everybody has with each other, and I don't want to break down all the diplomatic geopolitical issues here, but that it would make the most sense for just Assad and Russia to deploy their troops to this buffer zone and kind of patrol it, as both of these states have relationships with both Turkey and the Kurds. So they kind of work there, just like the United States does, interestingly enough. And so my guess is that this ends up getting implemented. That's the way it goes down with Russians and Syrian Arab Army forces. And, wouldn't this be the most interesting thing you have here, Will Porter, where the, Trump administration is able to negotiate a deal where Russian and Syrian forces replace the Americans as the human shield separating the Turkish-backed forces, their own army forces, and their Al-Qaeda proxy forces, and then our, kind of Syrian allies, the Syrian Kurds. And basically, you just, replace the U.S. as human shields with the Russians as human shields. And yet, Trump is somehow going to be paraded around as a dupe of Vladimir Putin.
Yeah, I mean, in that case, that seems like that's not only the best case scenario for the U.S. and U.S. policy is extricating ourselves from this complicated, foreign mess, but also probably the best for the Russians and the Syrians too. Everyone, it works out for everybody. But of course, it's just going to be spun as oh, look at, we've given all this influence to Russia. Influence, I don't know. I think another way to describe it is, as you said, is we've allowed them to become human shields to, in this, crazy complicated mess between the Kurds and the Turks that we helped to create. That they're basically helping to resolve it, I think is a good thing for us. It's certainly not, I don't know, it's a very strange mentality that says that, if you give any role in some kind of, war overseas, if you give that over to some other country, that you've ceded influence to them or something. It's it sounds like we've just handed them a quagmire that they're willingly going to take on. I don't know, but yeah, I definitely tend to agree with your analysis there over the ridiculous spin that we should expect from the media.
So if anybody out there knows a Trump speechwriter, Tell him to include the line, while Obama deployed U.S. forces to Syria to act as human shields between our Turkish and Kurdish allies, I have cleverly negotiated Russians and Syrians to now take that position. It'd be fantastic. He could laugh in Nancy Pelosi's face as he says it, and it would be absolutely true and great for the Americans. Remember, there are actual Americans, at least 2,000, although I've seen several people have hinted that that number is much closer to 4,000. When I think the U.S. is only allowed to legally deploy 502 troops there right now, kind of by our own laws. And so, we could take all these people out of harm's way, and, have the Russians and Assad, spend their money, their lives, their soldiers there, not us. And I don't know. Seems like a great deal and a great selling point for Trump's American first foreign policy to me.
Yeah, and unfortunately, I don't know if Trump is even sophisticated enough to understand that that's what he's done here. Or that's sort of what he could do. I don't know if he even has the vision to see that that's one outcome of his policy here. And so that's unfortunate. I just don't know where he stands in this. I don't know exactly how sophisticated he is on these issues. However, real quick, just to cover, you mentioned the troop numbers in Syria. One thing I forgot to mention in relation to the suicide bombing in Manbij was there was a photograph of a helicopter that actually evacuated the wounded soldiers out of there. And B at Moon of Alabama pointed out how this helicopter is not one used by the U.S. military. It's used by U.S. defense contractors. And he just sort of used that little point to highlight that the defense contractor presence in Syria might be a lot higher than you think it is. The official troop number might even be higher than we think it is. It might be over 2,000. But we should also, look out for the private Merc presence there as well.
All right, well, there's a few other big stories in the news that I want to talk about with you today, especially since I have interviews coming up all next week. And, I think these are pretty important stuff that I want to address. The big one, I think, probably even more important than Syria, actually, although it'll get much less media attention, is the U.S. announcing that they will withdraw from the INF treaty in a month as they have rejected the Russian proposal to kind of work out the differences between that the U.S. has with Russia on the INF treaty. Of course, just really quick, the INF treaty is an intermediate range missile treaty that basically says the U.S. and Russia will not create missiles or their launchers that have a range of between 500 and 5,500 kilometers. So anything longer than a short range or an intercontinental ballistic missile, it eliminated all these kinds of missiles that carry nuclear warheads. So now there's some issues. The U.S. says that Russia has a missile with a range of, I believe, 660 kilometers, and that would be a violation of this treaty. So, Will, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, this is unfortunate. I believe the Trump administration threatened originally to leave the INF treaty back in October. And so this is sort of not a new, point. This is not a new thing they've raised. However, now it seems like they're actually going to take some steps to leave. And I believe since 2013 or 2014, the U.S. has maintained that Russia has been testing and using this non-compliant missile. I believe the missile is called the SSC-8. Or at least that's one of the designations for it. I think it has multiple names. However, the Russians have turned around and accused the U.S. of also violating the INF treaty by by stationing I believe, Patriot missile batteries in Poland and Romania and stuff. And they say these could be used to fire other missiles that would then violate the treaty, as far as I understand. However, in both cases, nobody has presented any evidence. No one's allowed any inspections to be taken or to be done. And so it's sort of all a he said, she said kind of thing. So both sides have these outstanding accusations, and they have not really gone forward with resolving them. And as far as I understand, the INF treaty has something established called the Special Verification Commission, which is like a forum where exactly these kind of compliance issues could be sorted out, and perhaps inspections could even be arranged, mutual inspections. But I don't know if the U.S. is even wanting to do that. I don't know if they want to go forward with this procedure. It might just their refusal to go along with this, their insistence on getting out of the INF might just be a move to antagonize Russia. And with John Bolton in the position he's in, it's not that doesn't seem like a foregone conclusion, or it doesn't seem like we should dismiss that. Excuse me. That this is just to antagonize Russia. We definitely know that John Bolton is a huge, he's not a huge fan of arms control agreements, especially those with Russia, as we saw with the ABM treaty. And so, yeah, I mean, this is a worrying worrying development, which could be resolved pretty easily, I think, if the parties really wanted that.
Well, yeah, there's a few important things that you bring up that I want to kind of expand on a little bit. With Bolton pulling out of the ABM treaty, it's important to remember that as we look back on that, the U.S. has now spent hundreds of billions of dollars on these missile defense systems that do not have a really high intercept accuracy. If you look at the actual data, I don't think you will feel secure that Russian intercontinental ballistic missiles fired at the United States with nuclear warheads would be intercepted. But I think even more importantly is that when you look at kind of the status of the nuclear capabilities of the United States and Russia, 15 years after the U.S. vacated that treaty, Russia has clearly, I think, improved their standing more. While the U.S. has developed these very expensive missile systems that, mostly line the pockets of the military-industrial congressional complex and, proved variable and, not very optimistic results at best, Russia has since developed a hypersonic missile that deploys nuclear warheads that basically render these anti-ballistic missile systems completely useless. And so, with spending far less money, the Russians now have weapons that could get around the U.S. defense systems. And now I saw today Trump spouting off about developing anti-missile systems in space and weaponizing space and all this other kind of crazy stuff. And so, John Bolton, wanting to vacate this treaty, he doesn't have a good track record on vacating nuclear treaties with Russia. And the president should be very skeptical of him. Unfortunately, he won't be. And I think, unfortunately, as well, that this whole Russiagate hysteria has been worked up to such a degree that now, even when Donald Trump isn't, trying to make great relations with Russia, but simply to walk back some of the sanctions that he has put on Russia, like there's a couple of companies he's looking to lift sanctions on right now, the Congress is blocking it, and the Russiagate hysterics are going nuts saying this is proof that Donald Trump, is owned by Vladimir Putin. So I'm sure if in 2 months the U.S. doesn't withdraw from this treaty, these people will be saying, oh, well, Trump is only still in it because Vladimir Putin told him to be.
Yeah, exactly. And that's exactly what I was saying with the confluence of like the war hawks and the never Trumpers. Like it's a perfect little game they've got going here. But it's really unfortunate with things like the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty and the ABM Treaty, because these things were like, I don't know, hallmarks or cornerstones of the post-Cold War sort of like status between the U.S. and Russia. And these things kind of like helped to mitigate and stop the arms race that was happening between the Soviet Union and the United States. And now we're seeing these treaties kind of slowly fade away, and we're, or not slowly, abruptly in some cases, we abruptly cut with them, break with them. And now we're seeing exactly what those treaties were supposed to prevent. And that's like, things like an arms race where we see Russia, developing more advanced missiles. And then we try to respond by developing anti-ballistic missile systems and so on and so forth. And before you know it, you have, both sides significantly more heavily armed. And the potential for a really costly, really, deadly conflict has gone up. And so that's a real problem. That's really unfortunate with these, especially when you have the president and his whole administration looking at like large power, rivalry, large rival competition. In the meantime, we're driving this arms race. It's pretty worrying.
Yeah, the last thing I want to mention is that Russia did offer the United States some attempt to resolve the U.S. issue with the Russian missile. Russia says it only has a range of 400 kilometers and offered the United States what they called a static examination of the missile. So I guess that means that, the United States doesn't get to take it and break it apart and, tinker with it all they want and, I don't know, shoot it off or something. The United States want to be able to kind of do whatever they want with the missile. I'm not sure, I don't know enough about international relations to know what would be kind of the normal procedure here. If the United States should get actual physical, kind of control over the missile, or if, the static option that the Russians offered is typical, and that would be enough to determine the actual range of the missile. So if anybody out there is a rocket scientist, let me know. The next article, also very important, is NITERS. It got, it said Yahoo News got released. This was published by Yahoo News. That was surprising in itself to me. By FOIA released this document from the Pentagon that says that they trained Emirati Air Force for the war in Yemen. And so we've had time after time the Pentagon say, nope, we're not involved in the Saudi coalition. We just sell them weapons. We just provide the mid-air refueling, but this isn't, training and involvement in the coalition. But here we go with actual Pentagon papers saying, yep, this is proof that the United States has been training the Emirati Air Force for the war in Yemen.
Yeah. So this document is pretty fascinating. I think it's an Air Force document specifically. It makes specific mention. It says that, training Emirati pilots in preparation for combat missions in Yemen. Like, it says it in no uncertain terms. And it seems kind of odd that the Pentagon maintains the position they do, because, as we've covered on the show in depth, like, there's a lot of support that the U.S. gives to the Saudi-led coalition. Everything from, up until recently, mid-air refueling and vehicle maintenance and arms sales, targeting information, and then, of course, diplomatic support in, international bodies. And so the idea that we're not a direct participant is, to me, absurd. However, I think the Pentagon is sort of maintaining a more legalese kind of argument here, which says, like, as long as they don't do certain specific tasks, then they can maintain that they're not a direct participant. However, even that is belied by this document that Nick Turse uncovered, which says that we are providing direct combat, training and assistance to the coalition. It should be noted, too, Nick Turse is an amazing reporter. He's one of the best, investigative journalists there are. And he usually covers the Africa beat, but in this case, I guess he's writing for Yahoo News and covering Yemen.
Yeah, what heroic work that Nick Turse does. He sits there and writes about all these programs going on in Africa that nobody really pays attention to because, nobody even knew there was an African country named Niger until U.S. troops were killed there and thought you pronounced it a different way. And he sits there and writes about day in and day out. That way there's a record. Oh, look, Nick Turse is writing about U.S. troops deployed to Cameroon. Oh, and look, it's possible that the Cameroon security forces are torturing prisoners in a security prison pretty close to the United States where they are there. And, if we didn't have the great reporting by Nick Turse, we would have never known that U.S. troops were there in the first place. And like I say, it just gets so little attention because nobody knows that the first thing about Africa or would think that U.S. troops are deployed there and are shocked as hell when I tell them that, there's radical Islamic groups and people calling themselves ISIS running around, in West Africa where they're like, well, aren't the people there black and they're not Muslim, right? You know what I mean? They don't know the first thing about the region and are shocked as hell to, find out all these different kind of things. So, that's really important work by Nick Turse. This, I think, is extremely important just because, the Pentagon's lied to Congress about it. And there does seem to be some senators interested. Elizabeth Warren, at least in the past, has been very upset with the Pentagon's lack of, forthcoming with the nature of the, U.S. involvement in the war there. And now that she's a presidential candidate, I don't know, maybe she'll back off. I don't think she's actually principally super good on this stuff anyways, but it does seem like to be an easy way to score points against the president. So, maybe she'll take up the charge and use her position as a senator to, hold some investigations and, maybe we'll see some heads roll at the Pentagon or something.
Yeah, it would be great if this could drive some of the congressional and Senate, efforts against the war. There was obviously those 2 war power resolution bills that were being considered. And so hopefully this kind of event will drive that kind of opposition in, both houses.
All right. Well, the last story I have here for us today is, I will say we'll probably have less analysis on it, but all the same, it's pretty important and, it's getting some world news attention that as Al-Shabaab carried out a terrorist attack. A suicide bomber blew himself up and then 4 gunmen entered a hotel complex in Kenya. 21 people, not including the attackers, are killed, including an American and I believe a couple other people from Western Europe. So, you get actually English news writing about it. I think some of the significance here is that it is Al-Shabaab. In the past on the show, I've, said that Al-Shabaab is not an international terrorist group. And I guess I do have to kind of rephrase myself there. What I was trying to explain is that Al-Shabaab, I don't think, is a threat to carry out terrorist attacks in the West, like Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula or, like an Islamic State or somebody claiming, to be working with those groups. but that we can see that they are a regional power, and also that there's regional actors in Africa as well. A lot of the deployment of forces there, especially attempting to control the southern area of Somalia, where Al-Shabaab is, mainly located, is heavily African Union. And so that you have various forces, I think Ethiopian and Kenyan and Ugandan, pretty heavily involved in Somalia. And so this could be an example of blowback, but all the same, Al-Shabaab is acting internationally.
Yeah, I thought this was interesting. It kind of it just illustrates how Al-Shabaab is kind of not going anywhere, that they're now able to project force across borders into other countries. And I know Kenya has had some involvement in Somalia's recent history. I think Kenyan troops even marched into Somalia at one point in the last decade. And so there's all kinds of outstanding, political issues between the Somalis and Al-Shabaab and the Kenyans. However, I think you were talking about there's an election coming up in Somalia, and that perhaps this has something to do with that.
Yeah, I thought maybe it was actually a past election. So Somalia, of course, is divided into four autonomous factions, with the Al-Shabaab controlled southern area of Somalia being one of them. They had regional presidential elections. One of the candidates was a former number 2 of Al-Shabaab and claimed that he had gone through the de-radicalization process agreed to by the Somali government to then transform himself from an insurgent militant terrorist actor against the government to a legitimate, kind of political actor, a normal Somali politician. And then he was arrested by, I believe, Somali and African Union forces. And the people of Al-Shabaab and Southern Somalia as a whole, I think, were very upset by this, feeling that, the government wasn't playing by the rules of the game. And so it's certainly possible that this plays into effect. The United States has been carrying out heavy bombings of Afghanistan. I think, why am I saying Afghanistan here? Somalia, I think 47 or 48 recognized by the Pentagon in 2018. And so that's an important thing too, is just that, we're certainly hitting Al-Shabaab, or at least targets we believe to be Al-Shabaab, pretty hard. It could even be driving Al-Shabaab to seek refuge in Kenya. Right.
So there's so many, I don't know, I think Al-Shabaab and Somalia is a very good theater to see how, U.S. policy has blowback, or what Scott Horton calls backdraft in a more immediate sense. There's all kinds of cases there that you can see sort of almost direct, immediate, outcomes of these sort of policies.
All right. Well, thank you for coming back on the show. I think we put together another good one for the listeners. Tell everybody where they could find you, especially your Patreon page, because everybody should be donating to Will too.
Yeah, I appreciate that, man. As Kyle said at the beginning of the show, you can find my writing at antiwar.com, the Libertarian Institute, Consortium News, The Daily Sheeple. On Twitter, I am at WKPANCAP, ANCAP. And on Patreon, I am patreon.com/WKPjournalist. And I believe that is all my places. Oh, Minds.com. Minds.com/Will Porter is also, you can find me on there.
All right. And I'm at Immersion News on Minds.com. Immersion News is the name of my news website. Check that out. It's updated pretty frequently, more than once a day. So a little bit more rapid than my news roundup, which appear every morning on the Libertarian Institute and now at the LP Mises Caucus website. You can find this show at libertarianinstitute.org. Twitter at KYAAALE, patreon.com/foreign policy focus.